Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the Archives Book Club. Today I'm here, my good friend Adraseth,
Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Episode 10 of the Archives Book Club.
and we've got a little something different for you here today. We are doing a series of essays instead of a book. Adraseth, you wanna lay it down for us?
Yeah, so this came up on Eric's radar. I actually hadn't read this blog post before in this topic. We talked about it briefly, but it's this idea of something called tacit knowledge. And so this comes from the CommonCog.com blog, and it's the Tacit Knowledge series. And I believe Cedric Chin is the author of it. And he's in this blog post, it's a summary of some research done by some psychologists and cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists about this idea of tacit knowledge. And so this is the Cliff Notes, which is nice for us because we can go through the summary a little bit easier. And if you haven't read it, it's not a long read. But if you want to dive deeper, we'll go into some of the deeper topics in this episode.
Yeah, and I think that this is really cool because it really touches on some of the concepts that we've studied. It actually contradicts some of them as well.
Mhm.
The idea that you can't overpower all of this stuff with your conscious mind, your rational thought process of stepping through things, and you also can't transfer knowledge in that way. So it's not enough to pick up a book and say, I'm going to read this material and I'm going to be better just for having done it. And I don't need to do a lot of actual practice and doing of the thing itself, which I found really interesting because kind of the premise of what we're doing here is like, oh, I'm going to read these books and it's going to make me better at doing StarCraft and doing other stuff. And this sort of nuances that in a way that I found really, really interesting.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic for me as well. For partly because it has to do with my profession. That in geology and geosciences, or any physical science, when you're teaching students that physical science, you literally have to go outside, right? And this is the big argument that a lot of people have is say, well, especially now during coronavirus times where we're doing a lot of virtual learning, online learning, if you're listening to material, reading material, and you're trying to absorb it, but you're not physically interacting with that material, you're not hands-on experience with that material, it's a lot more difficult, right? So this is something I've heard in my profession before. And when it comes to StarCraft, the way that we learn and progress in StarCraft, I think there's a lot of direct relatability here because people might spend a lot of time, say, on a forum like Reddit, talking about strategy, theory crafting, but does that actually help you more than playing or more than watching? And we're going to get into a lot of those ideas today because uh, that's essentially the nebulous term tacit knowledge, which isn't well defined, but we can sort of define it here. I'd say um, it's this idea of the knowledge that it can't be captured by words alone, right? Which
Hmm.
sounds kind of odd because when you talk about StarCraft, you're using words, but it's the knowledge, and I think the author of the blog gives the example of riding a bike.
Yep.
So it's the knowledge of learning how to do something, sometimes through imitation, sometimes through direct contact learning. But it's this non-tenable knowledge that has to be transmitted. And how do we get that? And how do we learn it? So we could jump right into the four parts of this blog.
Yeah, let's
Um,
do it.
so the first part that Cedric Chin wrote about is why tacit knowledge is more important than deliberate practice. And we have talked about deliberate practice a lot, and I think it's a great time to bring it back up. Um, and deliberate practice is roughly known in our community as this repetitive, grindy, learn to do worker splits and do that for 2 hours,
Hmm.
and you're going to be better at the game, or grind out this build order again and again and again, and you're going to be better at the game. Um, so we'll talk about deliberate practice in this context as well. But in general, knowledge, in my feeling after reading this blog post and all the books we've done, is actually a two-parter. There are things that are explicit that you need to maybe read about or hear about or have somebody tell you to do. But then there's also this tacit knowledge side of things where you have to physically do it or see it and imitate it in order to really get it. And it's that really getting it, like in quotes, air quotes, getting it, that's so
Hmm.
important when you're trying to actualize and learn material.
Yeah, yeah. So my conception of this was that it is sometimes a shortcut to do the, explicitly explained knowledge portion of learning, right? So, for example, if you're just starting out in RTS, me telling you a couple of things like, hey, making sure to spend your money as fast as you get it is really important. Making sure that you're producing workers constantly is really important. And
Hmm.
trying to avoid supply blocks is also a big priority. If I were to tell you that, that would probably bootstrap you a little bit towards your skill growth, right? It would fast forward the skill growth to some degree. You could totally figure those things out on your own. You might stumble and kind of flail around at the game a little bit and notice that, wow, in this one game where for some reason, by random chance, I decided to plunk down just a bunch of money worth of gateways or hatcheries or whatever the hell it was, right? I did really well. Oh, I'll do that more, right? You could stumble into it that way. Or you can just have somebody be like, hey, this is important, just do this, right? And you'll pretty quickly see as you do it that it works. So it is sometimes a shortcut to have somebody explain stuff to you. That said, you pretty quickly run into scenarios where trying to have somebody teach you the right way to do something, there's just not a lot of traction there. So I've run into this a lot with Printf as he's coaching me through Cannon Rush stuff,
Hmm.
and I'll say, Printf, what should I have done in this scenario? And he's like, honestly, dude, that situation is so fluid and it changed so much. We would have to like frame by frame it. And I'll tell you the way you should have moved your probe at every given moment as your opponent was reacting to you. But honestly, it's not productive. You should probably just queue another game. So there are sort of the two opposing viewpoints. And the game we then have to play is, where do I get value? Which one of these
Hmm.
approaches for which task gives me the value? What I found really interesting about this sort of article series, one of the things the author sets up is this idea that I can use that, thinking, crunching logical part of my brain, not to do a bunch of theory crafting on Reddit, but rather to design and set up situations or mechanisms or training methodology to enable the sort of tacit knowledge acquisition process, right? So
Hmm.
I can still leverage that part of my mind that I really want to reach for and try to use for some reason. Like I get a lot of comfort out of that, but I'm instead doing it in a way that sets up the kind of learning that I really do need to do.
Yeah, that's an interesting, especially interesting point about being coached. And I think all of us who've streamed StarCraft before have experienced, or even if you're talking to a friend and you don't stream StarCraft and um, talking about how to do things, and say, well, how do I defend against the 12 pool? Or how do I defend, proxy this or cannon rush or whatever it is? Um, and you can learn that material by grinding out those kinds of games, right? You go to ladder, you get cheesed a bunch, and you're going to learn eventually. Okay, this works and that doesn't. But it's also a lot easier if somebody says, well, build this, do this. Here's the series of things, and you have to do it precisely this way, right? But it's even easier to actualize, internalize it if you watch a video of somebody doing it. But the tricky part there is, and this is my experience of it too, is that sometimes you watch a stream, you watch a video, you watch, some visual representation of what you're trying to learn, and the scene is slightly different than what you've experienced. And so you're like, well, that worked, but then the person went into Roach Ravager, and now what do I do? Right. Um, and it is this kind of fluid system where you're trying to learn things, but you need to experience it for yourself. You need to see it for yourself. But sometimes you need a little droplets of information to help you along the way. And I think that's why coaching can really improve this sort of situation where the coach maybe doesn't tell you directly, but they can guide you in the right direction, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
absolutely. I think another interesting kind of topic that's threaded throughout this entire article series is that idea of coaching and the idea of how good is the the teacher
Mhm.
as a practitioner of the skill, and how good are they as a teacher, right? So how much skill do they have, and then what is the clarity or the throughput that they have in conveying that skill to another human, and that those two things are not necessarily aligned. This actually makes me think back to, oh gosh, the name is slipping my mind. We The last episode that we did just as a duo.
Oh, just as a duo? Um, we did a recap, but that was before the
Yeah,
recap, I
prior to
think.
that, the last book where it talked about the idea of the coach who isn't like a top end like badass competitor at the thing. And there was an example of this like grandmotherly sort of piano teacher.
Mhm.
And sort of the value of that person as a coach, because one, they can teach you to love the thing, and two, they might actually be a better coach than the top end badass competitor.
The talent code, I believe
Talent
is what
code,
you're
yeah,
talking about.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
love
this
that. Go ahead.
go ahead.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, I love that example because I think we get really caught up. Probably the single most common logical fallacy that I see in the StarCraft community, and especially in the Twitch chat, is
Talking to you,
the
GMs.
the argument from authority, right? So I was arguing with some guy Wednesday night, and someone else who apparently knew this person in the chat kind of chimes in and says, you should show some respect. This guy's masters. And I go, whoa, 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 hold on. Let me just sit you down for a moment. First of all, it's an argument from authority. This is a logical fallacy. Like, you being better at the game than somebody does not make you right in your argument, right? Sure, you're better, but also, it is, if you are in masters, that is not a precedent that you want to set up, because there are a lot of people better than you. Do you really want this to be the measure by which your arguments are judged, right? Um, I'm getting us off topic here, but I really love the idea of the the less skilled practitioner who is a very, very good coach being incredibly valuable in raising up the new generation of practitioners, right? Through sheer teaching skill alone.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think you see this in professional sports in the United States, where sports coaches aren't always the top end players. They probably have played the game, but they may not have been the number one MVP every year and won, 9 Super Bowl rings or whatever. Um, Obviously, that can happen, and those people are good. But the problem comes when this concept of transmission of knowledge, and that just because somebody is good doesn't mean they can actually transmit that knowledge to another person well. They
Mm-hmm.
have figured something out for themselves to learn, but they might not know what it is. And the key factor here is you often hear people say, when they say, "Well, how did you do that? How did you get to be so good?" They say, "I don't know. I just did." Right? And I've heard that phrase in StarCraft a lot, in video games a lot, where it's like, "Well, how are you so good?" "I don't know. I played 10,000 games." So, well, sure, if you play 10,000 games, you will improve. That's clear. Repetition does cause improvement. It is not nearly the most efficient way to do so, but it does cause improvement. But uh 10,000 games, it's not you played 10,000 of the same game, right? There was
Mm-hmm.
a lot of variation. What happened during that time? What happened in your personal life? What happened when you were thinking about it? Did you talk to friends? Did you watch videos? Did you watch replays? Did you go to tournaments? There's so many things that probably incorporate into that 10,000 game um, learning experience to get somebody to a top level. And we're talking about the one, 99th percentile, the 1% or better players. It's clear that they've done something, but not everybody can do it. Not everybody can say as a coach what to do. And that's where it becomes tricky, right? In especially if you're a player that's looking to choose a coach, or you're somebody that wants to learn something, you're choosing a coach, you have to choose very carefully, because some people just simply don't transmit knowledge very well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the issue. And one of the things that's brought up in this article series quite a bit is this idea of imitation, where humans learn by imitation. And if we think evolutionarily about, our ancestors or our precursors and chimpanzees being very similar to us, you see chimpanzees do this, right? So lack of clear language, right? Not complex language like we have as humans, but yet they can teach each other things, right? And you
Mhm.
see this in all kinds of animals, right? Who don't possess a language skill like we do. They teach each other through imitation. So we know that that's an inherent property of our brains that we can learn by imitation. But these things that are tacit, that you can't explain well, have to be done by imitation. So you could tell somebody every step of the way how to skydive, but unless they skydive themselves, will they really know how to do that? And would you
Mhm.
want to take that risk? Right? I wouldn't. Right? I'd want
Right.
to skydive with somebody who knows what they're doing and imitate them.
Hmm. Yeah, that's actually a fantastic analogy. The idea that your body needs to experience it, right? And the way that they do teach skydiving, as far as I know, is they physically strap you to another human who is going to like run the process, right? So, all right, you're going to fly out of this plane and you're not going to die because you're strapped to another human who has done this before and knows what they're doing.
Right.
What's interesting about that, though, is you are still feeling every single piece of that except the part where you like pull the chute,
Yeah.
right? You're getting
Yeah.
flung out into the air. That part's going to be familiar. The wind's hitting your face. The air feels different when you breathe it. Probably. I don't know. I haven't done it. Um, you have to orient yourself in space as you're kind of flying back towards the Earth, and then all of a sudden the chute pops and you kind of, you slow down. And then the only other piece of it that you haven't felt is pull the chute, which you can do on the ground.
Yeah.
So I can completely see actually one why they do it, and two why it would work, which is sort of cool, I think. So getting back to StarCraft, I have found that this is kind of a rare skill in our scene and just culturally with the way that we teach. A lot of times you will find a grandmaster coach who is trying to teach somebody, and we do this thing where we either pose like a thought problem, right? Thought experiment. My opponent is hitting me with this cheese. I
Hmm.
scout it. What do I do? Or we'll show someone a replay and we'll say, okay, why did I lose? And it's very easy, especially in real time strategy, to pick apart a replay and go, oh, well, look, you floated 175 minerals right here. Why didn't you build your gateway 25 minerals earlier? You
Hmm.
missed that thing on the mini map. You didn't control this unit here perfectly. And you could just pick apart and pick apart and pick apart. And anyone could do this. You don't even need to be better than the player that you're critiquing. You may need to be close to their ability, but you can certainly critique up in RTS. And so I often find that coaches, GM level players, will fall into this trap of kind of doling out the high and mighty advice, right? Let me tell you all of the ways in which your replay is imperfect. And this is by no means a criticism of just GMs, but they're often the ones that are coaching, right? I think that something really kind of special and high skill in terms of coaching skill that I've seen in Printf specifically as one of my coaches is that there will be times I'll show him a replay and he'll be like, yeah, dude, to be honest with you, like you had a couple of things almost go your way, but just barely not,
Hmm.
right? Your reaction time was just a little bit slower, or the opponent's probe was just a little too close, or whatever. It was a near thing. And you were basically more or less ballpark trying to do the right thing. The fact that you're trying to do the right thing will pay off. And I don't even think that you should be sitting here picking this apart. You should probably just play another game. And he's the only person, I think, who has ever advised me in that way when I've brought him a very specific situation. Said, hey, man, like, why did I lose, right? He will occasionally, not always, just say, yeah, dude, you kind of gotta just blow this one off. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes stuff doesn't quite go perfect. And I think that's very high value for a coach to be able to do, to know when to say that.
Yeah. And you have to do calculus in your mind of, is a player going to improve by getting 10 points of criticism, for this replay, or if they just queue up another game and play, are they going to get more information from that next game and play? And I think the difficulty in StarCraft becomes that there are so many things that you have to do So this comes back to sort of where we started this conversation about there is some explicit knowledge in StarCraft in RTS, because there are things that you have to do, that you have to automate your brain to do, um, that if you don't, you will eventually just hit a wall in your skill and not be able to progress past that. And I'm talking about ladder MMR, or however you want to think about it, but getting better as a player. For example, if you are somebody that um, does not automate your macro cycles, where you're building workers, building your supply, building production, and producing out of that production, if you don't do that, there's eventually a level where you cannot progress anymore. You can say, well, I'll just cheese, so I'll stay on one base, or I'll cannon rush. I don't need to do production like that. But there'll come a point where you'll hit a wall where players can defend that. And now what happens, right? Usually in those games, and if we talk about Printf as somebody who plays more unorthodox, the game goes into phase two, right? So the cannon rush doesn't win, but now it's phase two. Okay, Stargates are going down, Robos are going down in terms of Protoss, right? And units are being produced out of there. Money is being spent, effectively. There's building placement, all these things that are somewhat explicit that you can learn, you can imitate, right? But you do have to know to do. And I feel like that's from a complete beginner, like Bronze League hero type beginner. If I've in my feeling, if you took somebody like that and you say, okay, step one, let's just learn hotkeys, because we know in StarCraft and RTS, if you don't know hotkeys, you're at a huge disadvantage.
Right.
And that's an explicit thing. You say, okay, if you're like in Brood War, P is for pylon, right? There's whatever it is for you, right? E, right? Like, however you want to do it. But you can go through that sort of level explicit knowledge on the most basic things that need to be automated. Once those are automated, then we're on to tacit knowledge. And I feel like that's kind of the division in RTS. What's your
Hmm.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, really interesting point. I definitely agree. There are a category of things that, or there is a category of things that you need to, or that you benefit by just telling somebody. So, for
Hmm.
example, something that is non-obvious if you sit down in front of an RTS for the first time is that while you have an option for how you input commands to your stuff, right? I could play mouse only if I wanted to, right?
Hmm.
Although that option exists, you should not take it ever, right? And nothing in the game tells you this. It's actually like kind of ridiculous in that way. I almost kind of think it would be better if the option were not there.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's something that we're stuck with, or if there are, maybe accessibility reasons why they want to maintain that. Although, our friend Daw, right, has gotten around this, and he's like just got his mouse hand, right, to play with.
Yeah, he only plays one-handed and plays in the diamond level of StarCraft.
And he's done this both with and without special hardware, right? He plays with a special mouse nowadays, at least as far as last time I spoke to him about his setup. But, for a long time, he even had the camera there. You could see his hand flipping back and forth between his keyboard and his mouse. So he totally made
Right.
that work up to a very high level. It
Right.
continues to blow my mind. And it really shows that the barriers in RTS are predominantly mental, right? Like he theoretically has half of the physical APM available to him that you or I do, right? From
Right.
just a raw theory perspective. And yet, right, he's able to achieve a comparable or better level of skill. So the limiting reagent here is not physical but mental.
Yeah,
I
that's a really excellent point about the physical versus mental. And you're absolutely right. Daw is a great example.
Yeah, I got us way off topic of the question that you posed to me, but yeah, to your point about where you draw the line between the tacit knowledge and the things that can be made explicit. I definitely agree with the things that you listed, right? So input mechanisms, kind of some of those things that I rattled off earlier about spending money or supply blocks. Maybe the concept that a tech tree exists and might be a thing that you want to
Hmm.
care about. Producing workers. I think, yeah, pretty quickly after that, you do get into. I suppose it is tacit knowledge, The reason that I paused and hesitated there for a second is that I bootstrapped myself through a lot of that learning process, but it was through this mechanism that we talked about earlier, where the sort of explicit mind designs these little challenges for sort of the I guess the sort of self one mind, right? Where you're saying, hey, you need to get this rhythm down. Here's a way for you to practice this rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
So in my head, I guess I've been telling myself the lie that, that was still the conscious mind doing that stuff, but really it was the unconscious mind doing, carefully designed practice routines.
I'm so glad you brought up the inner game of tennis, because I think this article series, this idea, draws a lot of parallels between that book.
Hmm.
And one thing that I remember, I don't recall me bringing up that much during that first episode where we did the inner game of tennis, but it stuck with me later on. And someday we're going to revisit that book, because I think there's so much knowledge in that book to learn from. But the author sort of starts off with this idea that the person who they're coaching already kind of knows what tennis is. It's not somebody that's like me. I've never played tennis. I know what a tennis ball is. I know what a tennis racket is. I know none of the rules of tennis, and this is honest truth. I know that things, if the ball goes out of the lines, that's out, but that's about it. I don't know what you need to score to win. I don't know how ties are handled. I don't know any of that. I don't know how to serve, nothing. And in the first chapter of that book, it talks about, okay, looking, somebody being coached and looking at himself in the mirror and then watching. And that's tacit knowledge transmission right there, which is a great example of it.
Hmm.
Of, okay, swing like me. I'm not going to tell you how to swing, but just watch me do it and do it like I do. Imitation, that's really important. But the person that they're training already knows tennis and already knows how to hold the racket and things like that. So there's, I think, some baseline knowledge. And I feel like even in an RTS that's quite complex, we could make a 3-page pamphlet that would have all the things you need to know explicitly. And then the rest of it is going to be tacit, and it's going to be this mental side
Hmm.
of learning.
This is, I think, a particularly interesting concept right now, like the specific moment in time where we're doing this podcast, because there are a lot of real time strategy games in development right now or that are
Hmm.
about to begin development. And these folks, I'm sure, are considering, how do I onboard people? Historically, RTS has had a
Yeah.
very, very big problem with being perceived as high barrier to entry, difficult even after the fact, stressful,
Yeah.
hard to stick with. And if you're a business and you want to grow a game, you want to grow an esport, this is a huge limiting factor on the success that you can have. So if those folks are wise, they should be considering questions like, hey, should we even allow the mouse to click to build structures, right? Or should it be
Hmm.
mandated that you have to press buttons, right? And again, maybe there is some accessibility stuff around that, but maybe you even hide it behind a menu, right? Click,
Hmm.
check this box if you need accessibility options and you're going to play mouse only.
Yeah.
I think that it's just a fascinating subject, and I'm very eager to see what kind of comes out of this moment in time where the next wave of RTSs are being made, and what kind of does happen down the road, 3-4 years, when we're going to have something other than StarCraft that, maybe could actually, threaten to eat its lunch, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And especially with the announcement most recently, just about a week ago before this recording, of Frost Giant Games. Everybody in the StarCraft community is extremely excited about these previous developers, one from Warcraft 3, but the rest from StarCraft team coming in, forming a company. Great, right? We're looking forward to seeing developments in RTS, which is fantastic. And that's a good point. What will we see, 5 years down the road in these new games coming out, where they have the experience to draw on from all 10 years of StarCraft 2, 22 years of Brood War, every other RTS out there, Warcraft 3, Warcraft 2, and so forth. How do they develop a game to bring new people in, and how do those new people learn the genre? Because one of the things that, and I think rightfully so, is people will say about StarCraft, oh, that game's too hard, right? I don't play StarCraft because it's too hard. I tried it and it's just too difficult. And even me as a StarCraft 2 player, playing some Brood War, getting up to like D rank, which is not good, right? That's not a good level of play in Brood War, but that was a huge struggle. That took months of playing to get to that level,
Hmm.
because other players were so good, and the game is very unforgiving. So it's an interesting idea of like, how do we bring people in, and do you make things like hotkeys mandatory and so forth. And I think it goes back to the development of those games, that in the early days of video games, well before anything like uh, esports was even a word, even before email was a regular thing, you were point and clicking, right? Most games did use way more heavy on the mouse than they were on the keyboard. And
Hmm.
so that's something like we could obviously as a community move away from, unless you have accessibility issues, of course. Or if you want that option, I mean, if you want to play that way, that's fine. But the efficiency of using both hands, or the efficiency of having some things on a hotkey or camera controls and so forth, or even better, teaching players that that's the way you're supposed to play the game, right? So the difference is, if you compared it to a professional sport in the United States, like tennis, you say, well, you can play tennis with, let's say the rules allowed you to play with any size racket you want, right? I don't think they do, but let's say they did. There's probably an optimum size then. And you can say, well, let the beginner just figure it out. Well, is that a good idea? Or you just
Right.
tell them, use racket size, X, whatever that size is,
Hmm.
and play from there. Um, so it's kind of it's a funny thing. But moving along in this article, the next thing, and I think this is really a great part of the meat of the article, and we'll get into this, kind of ends the first blog post and goes into the second blog post, and it's this idea of naturalistic decision making, which is a term that came up with, I think it was Klein, the psychologist, right?
Sounds right. Yeah.
Um, so it's this idea that, and it's funny to me that it stood out to me, because we did a whole episode on the book Checklist Manifesto,
Hmm.
which the author of Checklist Manifesto is quoted in this blog post. But the idea that a to-do list isn't an adaptable way of thinking. And to bring it back to that book, and like the Checklist Manifesto, where mainly it was talking about aviation and doctors, medical doctors and aviation were the two big examples they used. The checklist came into play a lot of times when the person making decisions was overloaded with information. And so in an emergency on a plane, there's an overload of information, and you're going into fight or flight mode. And so you need a checklist to tell you, hey, dummy, do these things in this order. This is how you're going to live. Do these things in this order, right? Or conversely, this is how your patient is going to survive. Do these things in this order every time, in this way, in this circumstance. But those are only good for very specific situations, which we can use as gamers, in our world, right? So you're getting cheese, very very popular and specific cheese of flavor of the week, right? GSL's had some cheese, and now that's on the ladder. Here's how you defend it, very specifically. But if you use that checklist in other parts of the game, it's really going to fail you. And so the mode that you want to go into is this naturalistic decision making, where you're adapting based on information you're gaining at the time. So we're taking information in, and then we're making decisions based on that. And that goes into the second part, which is called "Copying Better: How to Acquire the Tacit Knowledge of Experts." So from that, the author goes into this um, couple part thing. One's called cognitive task analysis, and the second is called recognition prime decision making. And they start using acronyms, and it got a little bit confusing, because it's like, okay, now we're talking about this in a very technical language and
Yeah.
technical sense. But the basic idea is that you, as a person, as a human, anything you encounter in life, you analyze the situation, and you start to make decisions about, have you seen this situation before or not? Right. Anytime you're in a new situation, you're drawing on past experiences. So in StarCraft, you go scout their base and you see something unusual. Have you seen that unusual thing before or not? Is there a missing production building or not? If you have seen it, you say, oh, yeah, 3 games ago or last week, I saw somebody do this. This is probably the build they're doing. I know how to defend. I need to make X unit. if you haven't seen it before, you start to go into prototyping mode. And a lot of streamers do this. This is really an interesting phenomenon you can witness at any time. Watch a streamer and they start talking about, oh, it's probably this. Oh, the opponent's probably doing this. Oh, I think it's this. I should be prepared for X. I should be prepared for Y. The Zerg player might go for Mutas. The Terran player might go Marauders with the slow upgrade. And they start to perform a model analysis in their brain of the situation they're in. And they go through this naturalistic decision making into the cognitive task analysis, into the recognition prime decision. The term's not so important for us to remember, but
Right.
thinking in terms of this model is really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I found it fascinating, and I love your analogy here of the scouted situation where your opponent has something weird that they're not meant to have. And the differences between something I've seen before and something that I have to go, okay, normally, let's throw out an example out. They don't have this much gas, right? Well, if I haven't seen that before, if this is the first time anybody has ever rushed battle cruisers or mutas or whatever it is against me, right? I have to kind of do this active crunching, this very slow, laborious, all right, they don't have the normal stuff. What could that, okay, well, instead of the normal stuff, they have all this gas. What could they do with that gas? There are a few different gas-intensive units. Hopefully by now you know enough about your opponent's tech tree. If you don't, you're starting to go, okay, shit, what other stuff does Terran make, like besides Marines, right? Like, and that's like,
and
that's
how much does it cost?
Yeah. And that's a legitimate phase of your growth as an RTS player. I was talking to my significant other, probably maybe a couple weeks ago, and she asked me, she's like, at what point am I supposed to know all the units? Right? And she actually played to a reasonably high level. I think she was knocking on the door to gold when she last was, seriously trying to grow her skill. And she asked me that, straight face, like, at what point should I know what all the stuff is? Or what's good against what other unit? So that is a very legitimate thing. And you could stratify that up to a very high level of skill. Like even in Diamond, I'll occasionally see something and go, all right, well, I know that's weird, but I have no idea what it means. You can find me saying this on my stream like weekly, where I'll scout some weird stuff. I'm like, all right, I don't know what to do with the information. And you'll see everything else fall completely by the wayside. I'm no longer controlling my units. I'm not prioritizing well at all. And I'm not spending my money. And at that point, it doesn't matter what they did. It's going to kill you because you just didn't make stuff anymore. So this is, I think, maybe the high point in the article series for me, actually. Yeah. That this recognition-based decision-making where I say, okay, I have seen this. I have a prototype in my head of what this is. I don't have to do all of that crunching. This feels like it is the skill in RTS. Like, how do I build these up in an efficient way? Because we know jamming 10,000 games, you've heard the 10,000 hour rule. How about the 10,000 game rule? Jamming 10,000 games will get me there. But is there a better way than that? It feels so unsatisfying to think that that is the only path. And we kind of know, and we have a strong intuition that it isn't. And the reason we have that is the bootstrapping and the skill growth that you can get early days when you're first learning and somebody says, hey, just try to dump all of your money. I don't care if you just make gateways, whatever. Or when you're further along and you get coaching help, the coach is like, hey, you're taking fights really badly. Try making a concave or not funneling up a ramp or whatever they had to tell you. And all of a sudden, like that, you shoot up 200 MMR. Right. So there is something there. We know that these shortcuts exist. And yet, many of us get kind of backed into a corner where those quick gains are no longer happening, and everybody just defaults to, well, I guess you got to work hard now. You hit the magic 3800 or the magic 4K or whatever the hell you want to think the number is, right? Oh, now you just have to work hard. I refuse to believe it because we see everywhere else in the skill curve that there are these shortcuts. I think we're just not good enough at teaching ourselves as a community to continue to create these shortcut points. The way that I think of this, and maybe I'm an example of a bad practitioner and a good teacher, I feel like I could ramp somebody pretty quickly to where I am. Like I could design practice and challenges and stuff to get somebody up to like low or mid diamond. I don't think it would be that hard. I remarked to a friend recently in Discord that I could probably teleport somebody to like high gold or low platinum. Like I could just get you there, man.
Yeah.
Um, the other topic here that I think is really interesting comes from our episode on super forecasting that we did with Max CU a couple episodes ago, where we talked about the strategy of satisficing. The idea that I don't need the best possible answer to this specific muta timing based on whatever stuff I happen to have in the game right now. I literally just need some shit that can shoot at them and move around a little bit. That's it. Or I need things that can shoot at them placed in the right spots if it isn't mobile. And it does not need to be optimal. Oftentimes when we get into this crunching mode where I'm like, okay, there's a lot of gas. What could it mean? And you're sweating and you're nervous. You start being like, well, let us ponder the comparative analysis of the value of the Archon versus the Blinkstalker versus well-placed cannons, right? And you really deep dive that. And sometimes I'll do the even worse thing of like, I make the Templar archives, start researching Blink, and put down a bunch of cannons. It's like, whoa, buddy, we don't need all three. That's for sure. Like, so my conception of this as I read it was, is satisficing like the skill in RTS? Is this like the primary thing? Is the entire notion of an RTS essentially competitive satisficing? As quickly as you can possibly do it, as quickly and efficiently as you can do that. And, is this comparative evaluation thing the enemy? Should we be really, really avoiding this? Or saying, okay, in games where this happens, I am making an investment. I will lose this game because I'm doing this crunching. And maybe I should sit with that for a couple moments and really hang out in that replay and do more of that crunching to try to develop this prototype. Or maybe I want a practice partner to run a bunch of different varieties of this weird muta thing at me. Or maybe I'll put myself in different states by opening up differently and having them run the same build at me so that I see all of the different ways that I could have to defend mutas from different positions and such, so that I develop a strong prototype. Like, it feels like there's something there where we need to be recognizing that anytime that crunching mode happens, that is an area where we don't have a prototype. I guess that was the big takeaway. That and this question of, is RTS essentially competitive satisficing?
Yeah, you raised some really intriguing points, especially when you talk about if you're doing the model analysis in your head, your automated systems start to fall by the wayside.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is true. And I think a lot of us have experienced that, where you start thinking about what is the other player doing. And you see this most often in our true and dear friend Florencio, in the Florencio files, which you can find on Pig's YouTube. So if you search Florencio files on the YouTube, you'll find that. Great entertainment. But 9 out of 10 of those replays are the opponent literally having a meltdown because they don't know what Florencio is doing, and they're trying to figure it out, right? Either through scouting or not through scouting, but they're doing every sort of model. They're doing 10,000 model analysis in their head to try and come up with what's the one thing that Florencio is doing, because it's so unusual. It's so off the cuff.
Yep.
And that causes their macro to fail. That causes their worker production to fail. That they can't micro, they can't make decisions. Everything just locks up and freezes up. And this is a really interesting effect, that when you go into that deep thinking, when you're using that part of your brain, you devote so much of your mental resources to it that you've basically roadblocked yourself to doing anything else. And I think you raise another really important point of the satisficing idea, like we talked about with Max, where you don't need the perfect response, or you don't need to make a perfect decision even. You just need to be decisive. And when you go into your growth mode of your learning, right? So while you're playing the game, you need to not do model analysis. While you're learning, that's where you want to do model analysis, right? And in the learning phase is where you kind of go through and say, okay, what is the prototype that I can either store in my memory for the next time I play, that I can bring that and say, hey, I've seen Florencio's thing. I've seen the friendship build before. You don't want to go attack it with probes. That's the wrong thing to do, right? You want to wait and get, stalkers out or whatever it is, right? Get shield batteries and stalkers. Or what's really common on the ladder in these days, October 2020, is for Terrans to block the natural of the Protoss.
Yeah.
And I've seen this even at the top levels in GSL where Korean Terrans will block the Protoss and the Protoss pulls probes and it's making zealots and trying so desperately to expand. And now, obviously, at pro level play, who knows what would happen? But in my experience, it's very easy to get out of that. You just build 3 gateways in a Twilight Council and you make stuff to attack, and you go attack the Terran who's invested money in a building that doesn't do anything.
Mm.
And you just go across the map. And then you have complete map control and complete control of the game, and then you take expansion. And so you trade off economy for this map control and attacking objective. But if you've never done it before and you're doing the model now, so you say, oh crap, I need to macro, I need to get out there. All of a sudden, everything starts to fall apart, right? And then the Terran can expand freely, can build units, do a timing attack, and you end up dying because your macro is behind. And it comes to a couple things, right? You have to have seen it before. So you not only you can't, and even if somebody tells you about it, it might not help, but you have to have seen it before, maybe experienced it before. Then you've had to have its time to think about it.
Mhm.
What is the correct response? Then you have to have time to try and execute that correct response, because there's going to be times where it just doesn't work. And it sort of comes into this expectancies, goals, cues, details, action items, right? This is the
Mhm.
model that Cedric Chin sort of encompasses in this image that he puts in the second blog post. Is his image of a flow chart. You're sort of, what is the expectancy? What is the goal? What is the cue that sets up the, what's the trigger? These are the things that you need to have in place to have the successful defense of something you've never seen before.
Mhm.
So it's really a two-parter, because in my feeling, it's a two-parter, because a lot of players want to get better. And a lot of people would say getting MMR is equal to getting better.
Mm.
And it's, in my opinion, it's not at all, actually. Because when you're learning something new, you will probably end up losing MMR.
Mhm.
But in the long term, you'll gain that MMR back. And you see this when somebody starts to use a new unit and they try and learn how to use a new unit. They're terrible with it and they start losing games. Like, oh no, I'm losing games. And we tie so much of a value to MMR
Right.
that we don't really value saying, okay, I've lost that game, or I didn't know what to do and I made some mistakes, but let's run through this model and get me set up so that the next time I see that, I can learn from that experience. I can see this build again, and I will know what prototype to use and how to adapt and respond. And that adaptation and response is the learning. That's the actual learning,
Mhm.
right? But you have to prepare in between that. And it's tough because, again, the 10,000 hour rule or the 10,000 game rule, people would say, well, you just need to play more.
Right.
And that's really not, although that does improve, it's not the efficient way. And like you said, shortcuts, I would say it's way less efficient, right? It's actually the most inefficient way to learn, but it's the way that most people have learned StarCraft to date,
Right.
which is weird.
Yeah. If you think about it, in the absence of a good set of tools for self-teaching, treating it as a exercise where I will mass games is a guaranteed way to get there. If I'm simply willing to show up and feed hours into the meat grinder, I get sort of unlimited dice rolls. I can keep kind of throwing random noise at the experience, and hopefully something will pop out the other end because either I had an epiphany while I was taking a shower,
Mhm.
or I was in a weird mood that day and I did some different build, or I got pissed off that the thing that I've been doing for 3 months didn't work, and so I tried something new out of sheer rage, or I griped about it to somebody and they say, well, I just do this, and then I try that, or whatever it is.
Mhm.
You're not directing it in any way. You're kind of just rolling dice over and over and over and over again and hoping that you get all sixes. And it works. It does work. I think that's why people latch onto it. But we also have
Yeah.
a lot of examples of people who feed years of their lives into that meat grinder and they cap out at a certain point.
Yeah.
The so-called hard stuck player. And it's
Yeah.
because you get stuck, you get trapped in a mental routine that does not solve the problem that you've encountered. We haven't invested enough as a community to know, how do you get somebody unstuck, or how do you teach that missing
Right.
piece? What even is that missing piece? We don't have nomenclature for the different kinds of players or different kinds of missing skill sets. We know kind of vaguely that I've heard Pig speak about these two shapes of player: the players who get to around diamond or platinum by a heavy focus on using their units and controlling them and taking good fights, and then players who do it by kind of just making stuff and throwing it across the map and hoping for the best. And we know that there's this sort of promised land after that where you can kind of marry these two things together. We don't have a lot of good tools. We don't have words about
Hmm.
or terminology around this. And I think this is why we see a lot of folks get stuck there, because we just don't have tools. And sometimes even the 10,000 games doesn't get you through it, because you've worn such a mental groove of like, I must spend my money at all times. I can't afford to look at that scouting adept, because if I
Right.
do, I might supply block. And in 2011, I watched a YouTube video that said, you can't supply block. So I can't look at the adept, right? I mean, this, like, we're laughing about it, right? But this
Yeah.
really was me for a long time. And when I took a break after around October of last year, when I hit Diamond 1, I was just finally starting to get over this mental hurdle. And I'm trying to get that back still. After coming back, I'm aware of the skill sets that I'm missing now, but I can intuit them. I can point to a fuzzy object in my mind that represents this. I don't have words for it though. I can fumble and I can talk here about sort of kind of what I mean. But that's sort of what I'm talking about when I say we as a community haven't built up enough of a tool chain around this. I know what that missing piece was because I acquired the tacit knowledge in the past, and I have to get that self-one process to have it back. And so that's kind of my struggle right now. But what about the people who haven't had that yet, right? And even myself, I got to that the first time through kind of just this throwing hours into the meat grinder thing.
Yeah.
So I've got
I think that
this. Oh, go ahead.
I think that's, just to add on to what you're saying, I think that's a really interesting point about um, people getting stuck and how do you unstick them? Because that is something that you see players do, and they say, "Well, grind more games," and that actually deepens the groove in which they're stuck in, right?
Right.
So it strengthens the repetition and the pattern that they already exist in, right? So the game is imba because some unit is no good, right? Or some unit is too good, and but therefore I'll grind 100 more games and just be ragey on Reddit. And there's no development in the prototypes. There's no model analysis. There's no, maybe they look at replays and they say, oh, this is bullshit, right? That's the analysis, rather than, or the analysis is the other extreme where it's, well, your pylon was 3 seconds late and you didn't drop a mule on time. You had 55 energy instead of 50 energy on that building. So therefore, you you lost, right? Which neither of those is actually very good for learning. It's that middle ground of, okay, um, do you have the inherent knowledge of how to do these things first? If you don't, build that up through imitation. If you're in situations that you're unfamiliar with, then it's the model analysis and decision making side of things, right? And both of those are very important. Both of those are extremely important. And it's sort of like, you need this evaluation after the fact, but how do you get that? If you have a coach, hopefully your coach is good enough to recognize that this is how learning takes place for humans. But it's tough.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. I think you're right that sort of, really honest evaluation coupled with the awareness of these different types of learning, which mode am I in? What thing am I missing? If I don't yet have the tools to conceptualize it, and I'm not able to design a training exercise for myself to start internalizing the tacit knowledge, I need to first get that figured out.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be an exercise that we shortcut, where I talk to people and go, hey, I'm having this problem. What do you think? Is there a way I can design a challenge? What have you? Or kind of looping on ourselves and going really meta here for a second, you can also flail at that one and feed hours into that, right? Okay, yeah. I don't know how to design a challenge, so I'll just try some stuff. And we've seen a lot of examples of that, different arcade maps and things people have made.
Yeah.
So you can certainly do that as well. But then there's this transition to that next phase where now that I have that, I kind of just have to show up. And no amount of me posting on Reddit is going to do it. I kind of just have to experience, right? And feed into sort of my own sort of wetware machine learning, right? I've got to feed data points in. So I had a few thoughts here on kind of that process of I know that I have a hole in my play and I need to figure this out and I want to shortcut it. So I'm going to seek feedback from someone more experienced, right? A player who's higher in MR, or even a player at my same level who doesn't have trouble with that same thing that I have trouble with. And I've noticed that there are a lot of flaws in the way that we do this. And the biggest of these is we will generally feed somebody a replay. They will look at it, nitpick it, analyze it to death and go, well, you didn't scout here. You should have known this. You, again, made your gateway at 165 minerals instead of 150, blah, blah, blah. What we don't do, and in fact, the game client does not allow for some of these things, is blind the person to as much of the knowledge as possible. What you would really want is to force the person to experience it with you in first person, right? In the way that they would if they were watching a stream. And by now I can feel the Twitch chat GMs charging up their energy. I almost wish I hadn't said that. But
right.
we would want for that grandmaster that I'm taking my replay to immediately not have the production tab on, hide the duration of the replay from themselves. Like, that should be an option, by the way. I shouldn't, if I'm casting something from replay, have to put my hand over the screen and try to pretend like I don't see it while I try to click the button that hides that from myself, right? It completely takes all the suspense out of the replay. And it can be damaging if I'm trying to figure out, what should this player have done? A big thing that kind of woke me up to how much of a problem this is when I saw the difference when HJax was coaching me really actively between the things he would say if I handed him a replay and the things he would say if he were watching me restream on Discord to him alongside Twitch. So he's seeing that first-person view with no delay. And constantly he would say to me, oh my God, I have no idea what is happening right now. Please send a scout out. And I'd be like, but HJax, I'm going to lose the adept. Or, but HJax, I'm going to supply block. I have to stare at my base. In 2011, I watched that video that said, I can't supply block, right? And he would be like, dude, I don't care. You're going to lose the game unless you can feed me more information about what your opponent is doing. Drop everything and look at your observer. You chronoed that observer across the map. It is sitting in your opponent's base, not getting attacked. Please tell me what those buildings are, right? This is something that you simply do not get watching a replay with the production tab on and God mode vision where you can see everything. Instead, what you do is you click to the opponent's base and go, yeah, opponent goes 3 racks, pushes you with 2 tanks, and you die. Defend better. You need to scout that, right? Mm-hmm. That feeds the conscious process. Oh gosh, I'm so bad at scouting. Oh, darn it, I'm such a dummy, right? What it doesn't do is give me the feeling of what is it like to prioritize that scouting? What is it like to go, ooh, I need to feel scared right now, and I need to have a sense of urgency about getting this information. HJax, when he was in that moment coaching me, he knew that in a tacit way. He had a visceral fear of the amount of missing information. And there's it's almost ridiculous to ask of him that he could surface that in an explicit, conscious thought kind of a way. That would take a very, very, very skilled coach to be aware that that was the thing that I was missing. But when he experienced it with me, because he was watching from my perspective, his body, his mind felt the fear.
Right.
And he instantly became aware of the fact that I did not feel the fear and I needed to. And I remember how many games he and I won. I mean, in a row, just win streaking like nothing else. I gained an entire league during the first little moment where we were doing that kind of practice. And it was because of our ability to uncover those kinds of missing pieces. By the way, welcome in everybody from Printf Stream. Thank you very much for the raid. We are talking about tacit knowledge. I'm sure Lord Cranial can provide you with the link to the essay series that we're studying. You're coming in about maybe 2/3 the way through. And we're glad to have you on board.
I'd like to add to what you were saying about coaching, and we were talking about the HJax, who's our local neighborhood friendly GM Protoss player, who's been your coach for a while. But that's an interesting part about StarCraft, is that especially now during coronavirus memes that we're all stuck inside and don't travel anymore. But even in the early days of StarCraft, how often was it that a coach would actually observe the competition or the actual play, right? So most of the coaching tended to be, okay, I go to my coach with my 5 replays that I have for the week, and we're going to analyze the shit out of them. And then next week, I'm going to provide 5 more replays, and we're going to analyze the shit out of them, which there's value there for sure to have a high level person analyzing your game. But exactly what you identified is the tacit knowledge of having those prototypes already ingrained and not being able to verbalize them very well, that when they observe from your perspective, from your first person perspective of, okay, we don't know what the production is. We don't know what the opponent is doing. We don't know where they are on the map. What do you do in this situation right now? And the only difference nowadays is a lot of us stream. And so you do have this ability to watch somebody stream, and if you're in chat, you obviously can interact with them, or you can interact on Discord. But in other sports, say American football, for example, they have training and preseason, and then they have season games, right? And so in between those games, they're doing practice and training, and they're watching videos, and they're learning, and then the coach is there at the competition. Okay, put all that together and let's do it now. And they put it all together, they do it, and the coach sees it. And then during the next week, they get feedback and say, okay, I saw what happened. I was there. What were we thinking? Where were we at? We didn't know the outcome at the time. And I think that that's something that's lacking for coaching in StarCraft. And just by the nature of the way, video games work and esports works, coaches don't often go with their players or observe their players in those sort of settings, and observing them first person, like you're saying, without a delay, and saying, okay, I'm doing my build. Here's what I feel. Here's what I think. And the high level players doesn't know either, which is really important to note that, of course, the high level player would know if they were playing, because they would be doing other things, which they have trouble explicitly telling you because it's tacit knowledge.
Right. Yeah, this is a fascinating point and something I had not considered even a little bit prior to you saying it. It makes me wonder if we are in the place that we're in totally by accident. The way that coaches in StarCraft think about and process information is a literal artifact. It is a side effect of the way that we watch the game and the way that the replay interface is designed. And by the way, the people that made that didn't design it knowing exactly what the best ways to do this would be. StarCraft is and was state of the art at replaying this shit back to you. Nobody had this. First-person shooters had kind of shitty demos that didn't have good user interface or tooling. StarCraft has real-time displays of everything that's happening, built right into the game client. It has charts and all kinds of stuff that it outputs after the fact. When they made that, they were breaking new ground. We didn't have the concept of like, okay, if such a thing were to exist, what would be the optimal way for a human to process it? It was like, the struggle was just making the damn thing exist in the first place, right?
Right.
And this is what makes me so excited about right now, this point in time, and makes me so hopeful that we're about to have this renaissance in RTS as we have, you know, Frost Giant and Sunspear and all of these other indie companies that are looking at, okay, Blizz just said we're not trying to make money off of StarCraft anymore. There's an opening. And we know
Right.
so much more now. And the other point is about coaches watching their players compete. And what they're watching, again, is that God mode view. So we have the same thing on the spectator side, on the observing side, as we do on the replay side. They're basically the same interface, right? And it's sort of natural that sort of player coaches, grandmasters teaching down to a diamond or masters player, or actual team coaches would take the position that they do because it was all the tools did. Nobody ever thought to question it or say, well, what is the better way? The other thing that I think is interesting about your sports analogy here is that we have something in esports, all esports, not just RTS, that we have never had in any form of human competition in the history of our existence, okay? You can literally see what is happening through the person's eyes who is the competitor. I, as the coach, can see your hotkey setups. I can see your vision. I can know exactly what information you had. And I don't have to say, oh, you didn't see this here, but you could have. I don't need to, if it's baseball, right? Oh, you didn't notice that nuance of, that player's body language that indicated that he would steal a base. And then the player says, oh, well, I wasn't looking over there. And you get into this bickering about what was even possible to see, right?
Right.
I could say, no, dumbass, look at the red dot on your mini map. It's right there. Click it, right? Whether I'm saying that to myself or a student, hopefully I wouldn't be that mean as a coach, right? But, but like that was never possible before, and we aren't leveraging it. And the reason we're not leveraging it is that it never existed, and the only analogies that we have are the traditional sports, right? So we're at this moment in time where, I don't know if this is the third or fourth wave of esports. That would be an interesting discussion, in itself to have one day. But whatever this next wave is, where we've seen things that don't work in terms of replay interfaces and in terms of, esports league, sorry, rip owl, poor Overwatch.
Yeah.
We've seen these things fall down, and it feels like the next wave of tooling and the next wave of structuring and all of these things are coming up, and there's just so much opportunity for figuring out how this stuff works. Bring it back to the article, because I've been blabbing for a while here now. I was very curious to get your thoughts on a pretty spicy claim that is made in the article, which is that your truth-seeking methodology, the thing that you care about, should be what works as opposed to what is true if you are a practitioner as opposed to a scientist. And given that you are a scientist, I thought, I can't wait to hear his reaction to this one.
It's a little tricky. I wouldn't disagree 100%, right? It doesn't irritate me in saying that a practitioner needs just to find what works, not necessarily what's true. And if I relate it to RTS, which is essentially the point of why we discussed this, more so than whether or not I think the author is a little bit off the rails here. And I will say this, and we sort of forgot to mention in the early part, but offline, Era and I had talked about this article, and we both agreed that it's a little hard to read in parts because the author is a little bit blunt and maybe a little more straightforward than he should be in his writing style, saying that he's right and other people are wrong. But if you get around that and read the article, there's still a lot of good stuff in the article and a lot of good information. That all being said, in the case of RTS, I feel like this is a really important concept as people grow in the leagues, right? And I'll give you an example that I had a couple years ago now, but it was during streaming, and you get people coming into your stream and say, especially, not that I'm that great at StarCraft, but I'm better than some people. And they would come in who are lower level, say, how do I do this? Or can I improve? Can you look at a replay? Gladly, I would always do that, because see what they have to say, and maybe I can help them. And sometimes you get people who will say things like, um, in my league, I always die to X, right? And then you look at their replay, and their response to X is completely inefficient, macro wise. That's really common in lower leagues than Masters, right? Macro is usually a factor in almost every game below Masters 2, probably.
Right.
And if you say, oh, okay, what if you, instead of focusing on there's 7 void rays at 10 minutes, instead of focusing on that, what if you focused on your worker production and spending that money and just building a bigger army? It doesn't matter what the army is, just build the bigger army and then go win. And you get, a lot of times you get pushback from people because they want to hear something like, void rays or imba instead, right? They've already made up their mind. They're actually not looking for help. And you get pushback from the players saying, well, whatever, this is imbalanced, this is stupid. I wanted to bitch and moan, and I wanted you to agree with me. And really, for that player, you don't necessarily need to find the truth of their macro being bad. You just need to find something that works for them, right? Because if they can make it past that game,
Mm.
and we all know in StarCraft, sometimes you just lose to cheese. You just lose to cheese. You just lose to stupid bullshit, right?
Yep.
Like Golden said it the best on his stream many a times, where he loses the game, he leaves, and he says, it's okay. Sometimes you lose to bullshit. And that's how it is. You got to accept that's part of the game. And it's a completely valid way of playing the game. And sometimes you're going to defend it and sometimes you don't. And it doesn't have to be a beautiful defense, right? So the Alpha Star perfect defense of a certain cheesy build is the truth, we could say in this
Mm.
case. But you don't need to do that. You just need to do good enough. You
Yep.
just need to get a passing grade. You don't need to get an A plus. And you can experience this in another way in StarCraft 2, is that if you watch streamers at the anywhere from Master 3 to Master 1 level, they're very good at the game. There's no question about that. But they definitely make mistakes, and they are not perfect. Even at the GM level, they make
Hmm.
lots of mistakes, and they are not
Right.
perfect. They get supply blocked. They don't spread their creep. They lose overlords. They, don't drop mules when they should. There's all sorts of things that people do. And I remember there was a player that I used to watch that was Masters 1. Doesn't stream very much anymore, but they were a Master 1 Zerg, and it was a fun person to watch. And I'd watch them, and they just did not spread creep. Didn't do it. Like, they put a couple creep hammers down, but that was not one of their skills in their repertoire. But they continuously played macro games and would win.
Hmm.
And I think to myself at that time, I decided, okay, creep spreading clearly is not a requirement to be in the 95th percentile
Hmm.
of playing StarCraft. It's clearly not a requirement because this
Right.
person has done it. Is it true that that's the correct way to play? Of course not. You're far better off if you can integrate creep spread into your play. But for that person, it works. And so I would say that if you are a practitioner, get away from the perfectionism, right? And in science, we almost try to attain perfectionism in a way,
Mm.
where we are constantly refining and learning and trying to disprove hypotheses so that we can learn what the truth is.
Right.
And that's an iterative process that has spanned the history of humanity since scientists sort of became a thing, right? Even as it became a profession. But before it became a profession, there were people trying to understand the world, and they do that in an iterative way. Um, of course, you can do what works, and you can say that
Hmm.
the world is made up of fire, air, earth, and water, which was part of human history for a while. That's what we
Hmm.
believed, and that works for our macro world, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't work on a atomic level or a quantum level when we
Right.
think about the world. So we refine that, and we become closer to the truth. So I'm not too offended by that statement or that idea, and I think in a lot of cases, practically, it's not a bad way to go.
Mm,
Don't try and be a perfectionist. Don't grind 1,000 games. Don't grind 100 games trying to make perfect worker splits.
mhm,
I don't think that's worth it. I think what's better is to find what works, then learn the tacit skills that you cannot complete or do without losing all the automated skills that you have, right? Then find that, get that into you. And then then build the analysis center, build the model center so you have a ton of prototypes that you've seen before that you can draw from. I feel
mhm,
like that would be, kind of summarizing what my feelings were about this whole article. It really kind of brings it to this, is that yeah, doing what works is okay.
mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. I actually really love the analogy of the conception of the Earth as fire, earth, air, water. It's not like super off the rails, right? Like it's
Right.
kind of sort of broad strokes true, right? There's a bunch of like molten shit at the center, right? Sometimes it
Yeah.
bubbles up out of mountains. There's
Yeah.
a bunch of earth on top of that. There's a lot of water in some places, and there's air above that. It's like it is like kind of right. It's not very nuanced,
Right.
and the claim that that's all there is isn't true. It's a lot more detailed than that, and there's different kinds of earth and kinds of air and so forth. But it's not totally off the rails. And I think this kind of it speaks to a lot of the subjects and learning mechanisms that we talk about here, where starting off with something like that and refining it and nuancing it and going, oh, okay, I I knew before that I need to make a lot of stuff, right? I need to have a lot of army. But oh shoot, if that army is just zealots, right? If I'm doing the staircase, right? The old that old, learning mechanism, and somebody only has air units, oh my gosh, I lose.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I can add a little bit of nuance. Maybe I want to have some anti-air. And you just continually from bronze up to as high as you ever go, the only thing that you're really doing is nuancing these models.
Mhm.
And I agree, yeah, it's enough for something to be workable for you and not necessarily the absolute truth. And as you point out, it is a very, very labor intensive thing to find the truth, and you never know that you even really got there. There's not a way to
Right.
confirm. You don't feed a Scantron into something at the end and, and get to know that you were right. It's an iterative process, right? We continually try to disprove things, and we see this at the highest level. We see metagame shifts where, without any patch occurring, something new comes out. Harkening back to earlier in our discussion when you talked about eBay blocks by Terrans at the Protoss Natural, Max, you wrote this fantastic article diving into, second by second, what happens in the Terran build order when you do that, and the fact that you literally don't slow down anything about what you're doing by doing
Mhm.
that eBay block to the Protoss. It is actually free. When I read that article, I was so afraid, man, that every single PVT was going to feel like playing a ZVP did, that I just
Mhm.
cannot put this damn base down. And it's starting to happen to me a little bit more, but it's, really far from the majority. I don't know if this is any different. You're a bit higher level than me. Are you seeing it more?
I'd say it's about 60-70% of the PVTs.
Okay.
But the thing about it is, and exactly what you've identified is, on paper, the truth is, it doesn't cost any money, and if you do it exactly perfectly, it's fine to do. It's not going to set you back.
Mhm.
The reality is, most players don't play perfectly.
Mhm.
And so them putting it down and their attention being focused there when their SCV is being chased by a probe and they have to be constantly looking there to cancel, that screws up their build. It
Right.
screws up their build enough that I don't lose 70% of my games or 60% of my games because of that block.
Mm.
So it is an interesting thing of like, yes, you can identify things that are the correct and perfect things to do. And if you do them, will you do them perfectly? There's the
Right.
question.
Right. I suppose it brings us back to the idea of competitive satisficing, right?
Right.
What we're talking about when we say the truth is this sort of, if you crunched it, what would be the optimal solution to the problem?
Exactly.
And the if it works is, well, did you just like come up with whatever was like vaguely plausible quick enough that you gained an edge over the opponent. And this is sort of the fascinating thing to me about RTS, because almost nothing else that we really do as a competitive endeavor really captures that aspect, the time cost aspect. We do so much comparative analysis, and we train ourselves in our school systems, right? The educational system really has a big focus on this. And to get like really indulge myself in the philosophical aspect of this for a moment, if you think about it in a fundamental way, this is a part of everything we're doing always, right? Like I'm gonna be alive for however long, and I can spend that doing a bunch of comparative analyses to get to the truth, the actual right answer of whatever, or I can kind of satisfice and move on.
Right.
It really feels like we're undervaluing this, and maybe RTS is a really cool tool to kind of illustrate it, right? Because we're able to batch a chunk of time and say, this is your competition. Here's your window between 5 minutes and 50 minutes or whatever, the kind of upper and lower bound of the, anything but extraordinary RTS game would be. Here's your time slice. We can go back, we can evaluate it, we can learn some meta skills that we can apply to other RTS competitions or to our lives in general. But it really illustrates the time cost in a way that nothing else I've really seen kind of does. So there you go, everyone. That's my sales pitch for RTS.
Well, if we were sitting around trying to find the truth of everything, we'd like literally never leave our houses, right? We'd be
Right.
doing cost benefit analysis of getting in our cars and driving down the street, and risk
Mm-hmm.
analysis of making a left instead of a right. And you can't do that. You have to parse things into what works and what doesn't, and based on my prior knowledge, what's the best choice at this time. And that's really what the second half, or part two of this blog series, gets into that a lot. Part one is more about describing and explaining what tacit knowledge is, and I think the modeling and the tacit knowledge really fit together like puzzle pieces. It really
Mm-hmm.
works well in this system. And I'll kind of wrap up here with part three and four, because we're quickly running out of time for this episode. If you do read the blog post, part three and four are a lot shorter than part one and two. And in part three, it just relates different types of knowledge. There's sort of relational knowledge, where it's person to person knowledge and how we transmit that. Somatic knowledge, where it's knowledge learned through body, in other words, emulation and doing. And then the collective knowledge, and that's societal knowledge. And we can relate that to StarCraft, I felt, as doing, playing the game, right? Somatic, relational, when this would be your coach interacting with you. And then I think the collective is, what are the meta game shifts that you kind of need to know about that's going
Mm-hmm.
on? That's the society that we live in, the collective we live in. And then part four, finally, for this blog post, is mostly about learning through videos. I don't think any StarCraft player needs to hear this, but we all know learning through replays is fantastic. Watching people play, watching pros play, not just for fun, but actually trying to understand the game and build up your model repertoire and your prototype repertoire of what different game states might look like, is really helpful. And I know it's helped me in the past, where I've been like, oh, I saw this in GSL, and this player put a bunker behind the natural, and this is how you defend it: pylon, shield battery, stalker, everything's good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it works, and that's what you go with. So part four just reemphasizes that. We all know that. So uh, if you do read the article, it's short, so you won't get too much more out of that, I think, as a StarCraft player. But that kind of sums up the whole series. And Eric, if you want to add anything else, then we could take questions, I think.
Yeah. The last bit that I would add is just that there is a little note in part four that I found kind of valuable in talking about sort of slowing down the process of watching the author's talking about videos, but in our case it could be a video or it could be a replay. They're kind of the same. But beyond just the slowing down, there's the idea of branches and situations which belong to a class. So maybe that is my opponent proxied some number of barracks, right? That is a class of situation that I may find myself in, but there are so many different variations of it. Is it proxy 1, 2, 3, or 4 racks, right? That's,
Hmm.
very broad strokes. And even within, okay, it's a proxy 2 racks, okay? Let's just say that's the only thing that exists in the universe. Well, what is my opponent's follow up? At what point did they lift those barracks and fly them home? Did they lift them and
Hmm.
fly them home? Did they lift one and fly it into my base to see what I'm doing? Did they lift one, fly it into my base, and use it for vision because they made tanks behind it? There's
Hmm.
all of these different kinds of wacky things somebody might do. And in studying replays, I think as StarCraft players, what we often do is we'll look at that one time it happened in GSL where player A did it to player B, and we'll go, oh, okay, this is what you do. And you go
Hmm.
try it on ladder, and it falls flat 5 times straight. You go, what the hell? Why can't I play as well as Stats plays? It's just so frustrating. He's so good. Oh my gosh. And yeah, that's true. He's better than you, and you're not going to have the skill sets and so on. But you really do yourself a disservice if you only look at that one game Stats played in GSL during competition and see kind of what happened. What you really need to do is watch Stats in 10 situations that look kind of like that one and go, okay, what does he check for? Where does he deviate? And,
Hmm.
you can, if you can happen to get your hands on somebody better than you's replays where they are in situations like that, that's great, right? And again, thinking back to kind of this, coming real time strategy renaissance that I hope we end up in. This would be a really, really cool thing for one of these companies to do, right? I don't know how you would solve the problem, but if I could say, I would like a lot of replays where the Terran player opens up double proxy racks. If I could scoop up a classification of build order rather than, what you see folks like Neuro do, where they painstakingly annotate replays and send them to you in
Hmm.
a pack. And then you have to read through a list of 50 different files and go, oh, okay, in this one, it's quick muta. Let me see.
Right.
If there were a way to scoop that up and you could look through it, that would be really good. You can certainly do it today, but it takes a little bit of brute force. And the other way that you can do this is you pick one build that you yourself want to do. I do this a lot on my stream, as I think many viewers will know. And you can look for the nuances that you hit, right? So I'm going to do this Adept Immortal timing. In what ways can it get derailed in the early game?
Hmm.
If it does not get derailed, what responses do my opponents have in terms of defending it? What things can make me lose? What things do I need to check for or be afraid of? And, maybe that's, I may need to know that I need anti-air. I may need to know that I have detection. And that might be it. But the
Right.
fact that the options are A, B, and C, my opponent fights me with brute force, my opponent fights me with air, my opponent fights me with invisible shit, mapping that out is very, very valuable. And so you can either do that by personal experience and paying attention, mapping it out, or if you have the tools and you have a friend or some way to get organized replays or videos, you can look at it that way and kind of break things down from there.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe we'll see that time. It's going to be, uh, this is a high point for us. Um, Everybody who's an RTS fan, we have some new things on the horizon. It's going to take a while for them to come out, but it makes me happy to know that we're going to have different RTS games that we can draw from, and maybe this sort of idea of modeling and analytics will actually be emphasized in some of these games where we'll have more information that we can draw from. And yeah, it's a bright future, I think.
So we'll open it up at this point for comments, questions, anything that folks want to dive into. We do have a couple that have already come in. Andrew, Seth, do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, so we'll do the comment from Lex Grizzly TO. Socializing knowledge is so important. It feeds everyone's own learning process so much. I've been doing a coaching experiment with Poison, incorporating my knowledge as a teacher to the StarCraft, and I've stumbled upon very interesting stuff. Devoting time to understanding the person you're coaching from a learning style perspective is so important, but oftentimes overlooked. Great comment. And I think
Fantastic.
teachers have to do this all the time as a profession, especially with teaching young people, because keeping the attention of a young person is exceedingly difficult, especially even COVID times. But people learn different ways, right? We don't, we can assume that, and this is the assumption we shouldn't make, but we can assume everybody's like us, and they learn the way we do, or they act the way we do. But people are very different, and if you were teaching our friend Daw how to do something, you have to take into account that Daw plays with one hand. He
Hmm.
cannot play with two hands. So if there's something that requires two hands, he cannot do it in that game. And so you can't just assume, oh well, do it my way.
Right.
You have to adapt.
Can we
Great
can we talk
comment.
about scuba diving? Is that fair game?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I taught Daw how to scuba.
I
Well, I taught him with the help of another instructor, but I did teach Daw how to scuba dive.
Yeah. So this is what I wanted to bring up because I don't remember why. It might have been on his stream or your stream, or we were in Discord, or I don't know what the heck it was, but I remember watching the two of you work this out. A particular diving skill
Mhm.
where, my gosh, it would be useful to have two hands. Holy shit. And you had to kind of think about it and work through it. It must have been on your stream because I remember
Mhm.
watching video of you. You're working through the process of, was it the mask flood?
Yeah, it's I think the mass clearing. Yeah,
And
mass flood, mass clearing.
yeah, and Address this kind of working through it like, all right, well, normally I kind of, put the, actually it might have been the Lost Mask simulation,
Oh yeah,
right? And like, okay,
even
how do I
harder.
get this? Yeah, how do I get this thing back on my head? If I'm on land, I could have my buddy just, strap
Mhm.
the thing onto my head or whatever. But Daw's a real self-sufficient guy, and he likes to find ways around the different challenges that get thrown to him, right? So he kind of wants a solution to it anyway. But certainly, if you're freaking underwater, maybe your buddy's not at arm's length, although they should be. You're gonna need a way to solve this. And I remember watching you, work through and go, okay, all right, so let me just not have one hand. I kind of like get the thing on my face, then I gotta like hold it there and get the strap. And I think that this is a really, really good point by Grizzly that, you know, you get a certain efficiency out of taking those things into account that you won't have otherwise. And that investment into kind of loading that up mentally and saying, okay, let me get in the framework of my student. How do they like to learn? Or what limitations do they have? What things will get them out of a learning mindset? That investment of time can really pay off in terms of the efficiency that you get throughout the rest of your relationship in teaching that person. I definitely have experienced this myself. I've been, the beneficiary of this with Printf, where I don't actually think he and I have ever spoken about this explicitly. So I'd be interested if he's still around or just in general to talk to him about this. He seems to have picked up on this thing that I have where I really don't like to do stuff unless I know I'm going to be successful. Right? I have a,
Mhm.
a lot of fear around trying something and failing in a way that feels very embarrassing. Like you shouldn't try unless you know it's going to work. And he either, randomly figured out how to diffuse this or explicitly thought about it. I'm not sure which. But one way or another, he has arrived at a way of diffusing this situation for me, which I now actually use in my life in general. He would
Mhm.
he would frame things for me in a way that made them seem like, okay, this isn't real. This doesn't count. So he would say things like, okay, we're going to do this skill. Obviously, you don't know how to do this. Let's just have you try it to form a baseline, right? And the engineer in me comes out, oh yeah, sure. Let's just get a baseline starting point. We know that I'm not good at it, so let's just kind of record that so that for the future when we do it for real, we'll know how far I've progressed. It's like
Mhm.
it tricks the ego so well, right? The other way that I've heard this is to kind of frame things as an experiment. Let's just do it this way and see what happens. You're not doing it for real. It doesn't count. Nobody's keeping score. Let's just kind of see what happens. I think either one of those works really, really well in terms of kind of diffusing that type of anxious personality, or that, I can't try unless I'm going to succeed sort of
Yeah,
psychology.
that's a good point. And Lord Cranial had this kind of question loaded up there and then he crossed it out, but I'm going to do it anyways because I think it's an important one for the whole of the community to hear. And does having doubts or anxiety about a match interfere with tacit growth or cause slow number crunching? And
Mm,
it does. It really does, right? This is a problem when you're anxious and you have a lot of adrenaline going. What happens in your body and your brain is you go into fight or flight mode. And fight or flight mode is not thinking mode. That is not a
right.
time where you can do growth. You're trying to survive, right? And for whatever reason, I don't know why StarCraft does this so well, but it triggers a part of it, and it's happened to me. It's happened to a lot of players. It triggers a part of your brain and your body to put such a high value on winning that match that you literally think that you will die if you don't win that match. That's what your
Yep.
body is doing. You get this adrenaline dump and you're like, I have to win this, otherwise it's the end of the world. And that shuts down a lot of brain functions that normally would allow you to adapt, think clearly, think slowly, because you're trying to survive, right? You're being chased by the lion on the Serengeti plain and you got to get out, right? You don't have time to consider, is left a better option than right? You just have to choose one. And so this is a problem when you get kind of flustered in a match and tilted, that you stop making decision, you stop analyzing, you stop doing the naturalistic decision making process. And so how do you solve that, right? Well, Eric just gave a really great example of doing the experiment, right? This game isn't a real game, it's an experiment, right? Um, Treating it with lesser value will help lower that expectation of winning being everything. And then your brain is freed up to take those experiences as learning experiences and add them into the model that you're creating and add them into the past experiences, which you can draw on later on.
Yeah, definitely. I think the only bit that I would add there is around GG timings. So there's a particular topic that I get a lot of flack for around GG timings, where if I encounter this scenario where I know that I don't have a prototype, I don't want to stay in that game very long. I want to get out of fight or flight and I want to sit and think and build more prototypes and kind of develop that. That's where I feel like I get gains. Oh man, did I ever take a lot of criticism back in the day for that. To the point where I actually said, okay, chat, okay, coaches, okay, friends, you're all very concerned that I don't have emotional resilience. Let's say that we're working on that for a while. And I would just stay in games. And I got a handful of few, cool YouTube VODs out of it, of games where, it didn't look like I'd win and then something weird happens or whatnot. Very suspenseful and good from an entertainer perspective. But I still don't think good for learning. However, I don't think I was right before either. The thing that I'm doing most recently, and by recently, I mean maybe even the past few weeks only, is to recognize that I'm in that mode.
Hmm.
Say, okay, I have a unique opportunity right now as I am losing this game. I am going to release the game. I'm going to say, okay, this one's lost. Opponent has BCs. I'm screwed. I can't probably get enough anti-air, and if I do, it's going to be this long, drawn-out thing, and they're probably going to beat me. And we're not going to GG yet. I'm going to do my best with whatever I have, not caring, because I've already accepted the fact that I lost the game.
Hmm.
I'm going to just wring out a little bit more information out of this game before I leave to set up some of the learning and to prime some of those prototypes in my head. Go, okay, how many stalkers can I get right now? Let's try an experiment. What happens if I wait? Let this person kill a building or two. Pull some probes from the main to the nat. Let's mass up stalkers for a warp-in wave. Okay, I see my gateways are halfway to the next one. Let's just wait. We can get to 7 stalkers. Let's try to fight the BC. Okay, I chase it off. What happens now, right? Now I've baked in a little bit more of that tacit knowledge, that learning, so that I don't have to painstakingly, inch by inch, experience every new little piece of it after I figure one out through lots of crunching outside of a game.
Hmm.
I don't think that it's like a huge improvement, but it's so cheap, right? It's so inexpensive for you to stay in that extra 30 seconds after you kind of know you're dead and go, okay, let's just see, right? What do they do when I come at them with stalkers? How quick did they warp the BC out? Do they fly to a different base? You can practice a couple little skills and then move on and do that crunching. So I think that's a really good way for folks who have a psychology similar to mine to kind of get the optimal value out of those scenarios.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that. I know myself, and I do this less now, but I would rage quit and then immediately queue another game, which is
Mm,
the worst thing you can do because now you're
yeah,
going to play tilted,
right.
and you're not going to learn anything when you're playing tilted. I mean, maybe if you come back to it and you really analyze, but you pretty much shut down your learning center as soon as you get tilted. You're kind of shut down. So
Mm,
that's a really good idea. You just accept you've lost it, and then okay, what happens when I build, you know, 2 rounds of stalkers? Can I actually kill this unit, or can I accomplish a small thing in the game?
hmm
I
hmm
like that.
Yeah, I mean, it does the emotional diffusal, which I guess is really like the piece that was missing for me to be able to get a little more learning out. Um,
Right.
it's definitely going to be kind of different for everybody, but I think it's something that's worth considering and thinking about. Right, everybody's going to get different mileage out of different kind of methodology there for sure.
Right.
All right, well, I guess that's probably a wrap, huh?
I think so.
Well, let's see. I think we could pass the raid off. Appreciate everybody hanging out. We can spam a few socials here for you. If you are interested in looking at past episodes of the archives, you can find those pretty much anywhere you find your podcasts. We've got an RSS feed. They're on Apple Music. They're on Spotify. You can get VODs on my YouTube. We also have a Buzzsprout link, which my social command does not give out. I'm an absolute criminal. As always, huge thank you to Lord Cranial for facilitating discussion for us and taking everybody's questions and comments. I will spam his links here. Thank you to my good friend Adraseth for co-hosting here and as ever making his fantastic show notes, which is a huge load off of me. We're going to raid over to Shu Yi's place, so please show her some love. If you have any interest in sort of funding what we're doing here, there is a Patreon. Obviously, not a huge, thing that you need to do, but if you like what we're doing and you want to see more of it, there are a few things that we kind of have in our heads that we could do to make things better for the show, enhance things in various different ways. So this is a hobby thing for us. We will pretty much direct anything that you feed us towards those kinds of things, at least for the very foreseeable future. So that's available if you are interested. Link is in the chat. And yeah, please go make it rain emotes on Shui. Let's make our presence felt here, everyone. And hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Happy Halloween. This has been a spooky archives.
Spooktacular. Thanks, everyone.